everybody. It is Thursday, 19th of January, and the end is nigh. I'm going to do 3 tonight because I need to get things ready for Saturday night for the big gala, and I need to make sure that I've got videos lined up to Saturday when I shall do the final 3. So this is actually, of the challenge, the final whiskies that I shall be doing in here. Because the final 3 will be live at the Principal Hotel in York. So yes, you won't be seeing this background for a bit, depending if I carry on afterwards. We're carrying on with Islay, and the 3 I'm going to do tonight don't exist in some form or another, but kind of do, if that makes sense. So the first one that I'm going to have is very much a cult distillery, very much a cult whiskey. Islay whiskies, very, very popular, very highly regarded, very collectible. It's the, you've got your Macallans and you've got your Highland Parks and you've got your Dalmores and all this lot where they're releasing very, very expensive bottles and super premium releases and this and that and the other. But even within Scotch, Islay there's a hardcore, it's even more hardcore followers and fans and lovers and collectors and everything like that. And Port Ellen, which I'm going to cover now, which is this one, is even more prized within Islay because it's a distillery that is now no more. So this particular sample is another very kind donation from Chris and Lindsay Cook. So thank you very, very much for this. Yeah, I am very lucky to have any Port Ellen, let alone this particular one. Port Ellen should be on the map because it's actually now a malting house. But it was a distillery that was really opened in 1824 by a guy called Alexander Mackay, and it was the site of an old malt mill, which is believed to have already been supplying malt to illicit distillers on the island before licensing came into play. Now he struggled, and the distillery was then sold in 1836 to a 21-year-old guy called John Ramsay, who was quite progressive and had, I think it was an uncle that ended up setting up a ferry between the mainland and Port Ellen. So that was kind of the main dock for the rest of the island. So there was a lot of business coming through as well. That eventually was sold, and it was eventually passed into the hands of John Dewar of Dewars and Sons and James Buchanan of Buchanan Whisky, who set up a mini company called the Port Ellen Distillery Company and bought the distillery from the Ramsay family in 1920. They became part of the conglomerate that ended up being Distillers Company Limited, DCL, which we've covered numerous times in this challenge, who eventually became Diageo. They're kind of the precursor to Diageo. So it became part of DCL in 1925, and then as it was in the kind of mid to late 20s, a lot of distilleries were either really, really struggling or closed down because they were surplus to requirements by DCL because of the post-World War I depression, everything like that, really struggling. Whiskey industry was in a bit of a slump, and it was mothballed. So Port Ellen mothballed from 1930 and didn't reopen until 1967, where in 1973 they then added massive like malting drums, big kind of machinery that means that it wasn't just kind of barley laid out on a floor with smoke coming underneath to dry it out and people turning it over with big shovels. These were kind of like massive drums that would kind of roll around, and you could dry the barley in a continual process, sort of almost feed it in one end and it comes out the other ready to go. And at the time, and they still do, DCL, who became Diageo, Lagavulin and Kalila, these drums were then to supply the malted barley, also not just for Port Ellen, but also for Lagavulin and Kalila, because they were their big name brands. So Lagavulin and Kalila particularly were being used in blended whiskey. Single malts still really weren't a thing. It was very much blended whiskey at the time. And because Islay was really known for being smoky, you didn't really need a lot, unless you were doing something like White Horse. So White Horse known for having Lagavulin in, and it has a peated element to it. You can sort of tell that there's Lagavulin in it, but there is still other flavour profiles in there that make it softer and more palatable to a more mainstream market. So there wasn't as much of a demand of the heavily peated Islay whiskey that you find nowadays, because it wasn't really needed as in such intensity in blended whiskies. So in 1983, DCL closed down Port Ellen, kept Lagavulin going, kept Kalila going, closed down Port Ellen, but kept the malting capabilities. And there was something, what was known as the Concordat of Islay distillers, where the other distilleries on the island came to a gentleman's agreement where they would buy a proportion of malt from Port Ellen, essentially to keep it running as a business. Because we've got Bamore and Kilhoman, and there was one other, God, what was the other one that's got the malting floors? Lefroy. So none of the other distilleries at this time were having their malting floors, so they needed malted barley from somewhere anyway. So Port Ellen gave them what at the time was a heavily peated malted barley to be able to make the whiskey. And as Port Ellen progressed from being a distillery to a malting house, it then was able to kind of tailor, right, we don't need it all to be heavily peated, we can do different versions. So that's what Port Ellen is now. Port Ellen is a malting house, it's a malting floor, it's a malting factory, for want of a better word. Whereas the distillery side of it, gone. Now owned by Diageo, and they are sitting on stocks of Port Ellen, and pretty much annually, a new Port Ellen will come out. It'll be part of their special releases, and there will be a new Port Ellen, and the price of it just goes up and up and up and up, because people know there is going to be less and less of it available. Eventually, it will run out. There will be no Port Ellen available to buy. Well, there'll be bottles floating around in the market that will just go increasingly in value. So this one that I've got from Chris and Lindsay is the 8th release, and this is a picture of it now. Now this is quite kind of not personal to me, but I was quite chuffed to see that this was distilled in 1978, which was the year that I was born, but this is actually a 29-year-old. I believe it was bottled in 2008. So its cask strength is 55.3%. So it's the 8th release. Now, this is available for sale at the Whisky Exchange. They are selling, don't know how many bottles they've got, but they are selling at least one bottle of it for £1,200. I don't know what Chris and Lindsay paid for it. I would guess a couple hundred quid. Maybe not even that, maybe about 150 quid. But yes, Whisky Exchange do have one online, as do Amazon, and it's 1,250 quid. So if you want a bargain, get yourself to the Whisky Exchange. So this is clearly highly priced. I think we're looking at the hundreds of pounds marks just when the new version comes out. And the thing is, it does sell like hotcakes. People are after this. This, like I say, this is a cult whiskey. This is Port Ellen. They're not making anymore. It's gone. It's Islay. It's all of these factors come in, and hype and discussions between whiskey drinkers and this kind of competition of, I've never had one, I must get one, and I will pay whatever I need to, which is putting the prices up. Now, I'm not trying to say Port Ellen is the absolute pinnacle of Islay whiskey. I have had a couple of Port Ellens a long time ago, and I remember it being a good whiskey. But really, the money that you're paying for bottles of this right now is more because of the rarity and the collectability, rather than necessarily the quality of the whiskey that's inside it. That's not to say it's going to be crap. Don't know, I haven't tried it yet. But you are paying a lot more money for the story surrounding it and its limited availability. So 55.3%. I have some water ready. I'd be very, very surprised if a colouring was added to it. I'd be amazed if it is. I'm pretty certain it's not. But it's still pretty light. Now, what I don't know is what it's been matured in, what cask. I couldn't actually see it on the label on the picture. So I would hazard a guess at sherry casks, which probably means it's bourbon. But I don't know what cask it is. Now, the thing with Port Ellen is there is a peatiness to it, but there's almost like a citrusy oiliness to it as well. This isn't a massive, hefty, smack in the chops of peat. It's always been more delicate. So we're looking at 29-year-old, and yet it's not like it's mellow. There is now high alcohol percentage as well, but there is a lightness to it, but there's also quite a tightness to it as well, which is probably the alcohol percentage, but there is definitely an oily, lemony character, as well as a salt and pepper. So it's kind of salt and pepper and lemon, good combination of kind of fish and chips. It's less of the fish and chip flavour than the, God, what was it that I picked that up on the other day? Was it the Bamor? I think it might have been the Bamor, where it really was kind of like batter as well. There's less of the batter, and it's not a cooking oil. This is like a maritime oiliness. This is much more coastal. It really is. And the oiliness is there on the mouthfeel as well. It's silky, but there is a slight oily texture to it, but it works. It's light. Obvious kick from the percentage, but there is enough flavour supporting it that it doesn't really mask anything. It's going to need water. I'm going to have to add some water to it. I think there's some flavours hiding underneath. But there, again, this citrusy element comes through. There is a definite black pepper kick, as though you've just bitten down on a peppercorn. There's a real, right on the tip of my tongue, there's a real intense black pepperiness to it. Very, very pleasant indeed. And very much a kind of, this would be a good whiskey to have with fish and chips. It's got the lemon juice, it's got the black pepper, it's got the salt, the sea salt, that sort of element to go with a really good fish dish. Yeah, you know when you get, I can't remember, something like lemon sole, and you get that kind of slightly oily butteriness to it as well. So it's melted butter, but it's melding with that fish oil. It's very, very similar to that. But there is a really good delicacy to it. Now I'm going to add some water. I've got something else in there as well. Seaweed from a Chinese takeaway. That sort of briny saltiness, but the crispness of the seaweed. So I'm going to add a bit of water in. Let's see if we can knock it down a bit. It is very, very good indeed. Now, would you pay 1,200 quid for a bottle of it? No, I wouldn't pay 1,200 quid for a bottle of anything, to be perfectly honest. But if you paid a few hundred quid for a bottle, would you think you've got your money's worth? And there is a degree of quality to it. The finish really does go on for quite a while. And I'm going to have to drink a lot of water between the ones that I do, particularly once I've done the last one. But it's light. There is a light, delicate touch to it, which I think if you didn't know anything about Port Ellen, if you were given a bottle of this, or if only, if you were offered a drink from a bottle of this and somebody said, I've got this and it's worth 1,200 quid, I think people that wouldn't necessarily know what Port Ellen is in terms of the history behind it or even where it's from, I think they would be disappointed by it because there's not depth or richness, which isn't the characteristic of the distillery and the whiskey. I just have this feeling that if you were given this without knowing what Port Ellen was, you would go, really? That's 1,200 quid a bottle? There's not a huge amount to it. It's much more delicate. You've got to really, you don't have to work with it, you don't have to fight it, but it's a lot more subtle. It's not big and rich and heavy and sherried and smells of leather and fires and this and that and the other. This is a more subtle whiskey, which when you work with it and you actually begin to pick up everything else that's in it, you're like, wow, there's actually quite a lot going on here, and it goes on for a long time as well. But again, oh yeah, with the water, definitely helps. That's really opened up a lot more of the sea salt, maritime flavours. Very coastal, this really is coastal. It's sea salt. The peatiness that's there isn't particularly heavy, and it's more of a peppery peatiness. It's a peppery smokiness, less of the kind of bonfire, not particularly medicinal either. But the money that you're paying for these type of bottles is more because of the rarity rather than the quality. It's still a cracking dram though. And I consider myself very, very lucky to have that, indeed. It's very coastal. It's very indicative of where it's from. It really kind of screams out coastal island whiskey. It's lovely. Chris, Lindsay, thank you very, very much for that. It's very good indeed. If you want to tell, well, I'm going to see you on Saturday night anyway, so if you want to tell me, I'd love to know how much you paid for that, because I'm hoping you didn't pay 1,200 quid for it. And if you did, why are you giving me samples of it? But I'm very grateful nonetheless. Thank you very much. And I shall do, I was going to say a quick rinse out, but I'm going to have to do a bit more of a quick rinse out to get rid of this peaty flavour in my mouth and clean this glass out for the third one. But I shall see you in the next one. Cheers.